Welcome to this concluding lecture on Vishwanath Ghosh's Chai Chai. And it's been a journey through a significant number of junction stations and an entry into some of India's most well-known yet least traveled to destinations. What I'll do in this class is fundamentally try and fold up the issues that we have discussed. And we will also talk about, very importantly, something we've not really analyzed, and that is BG's narrative technique, because part of the success of the travelogue also lies in the way in which BG presents his travels rather than only in the subject matter. And for this, I'm going to try and take a look at, BG's blogs, as it were, which I have already selected and sent to you as reference. Now, it is ironical because this is the only reference that you'll find apart from a few other reviews of Chai Chai. Now, BG, in one of his blogs, this is just as the novel is going to be published, writes that irrespective of how the book does, I'm glad I got off at these junctions. I happen to discover the India whose existence we city dwellers either don't like to acknowledge or are not aware of. And let me tell you, he says, that is the real India, right? Although, I don't agree with BG here that this is any concept of any real India, but this is an alternative India that he's right about. Our India is like a pack of cards. It crumbles even if a white man in the US happens to sneeze over it. But the India I discovered is sturdy. It has withstood greater battles than economic slowdown and continues to smile. So very consciously, BG is therefore, this is the first theme, that is trying to present an alternative version of India that is not located only in its metropolitan cities and its metropolitan consciousness, but in the small towns that the country is also constituted of. Now, he then goes on in another blog to talk about, and this is a detailed interview that he gave on Chai Chai. This is on the 7th of January, 2010, and he gives us a point of timeline for writing this. 2006, he conceives it, standing at Itarsi, what all might be lying beyond the station. He forgets about this idea. And then he was also writing a Sunday column for the New Indian Express and doing travel pieces. So he's already done occasional travels. And then he decides to put this into a theme. And then is offered a book deal. And he says, so I thought, why not go to these places? I'm so glad that the publishers found the idea to be different. And he then talks about, very interestingly, the idea of how to write about a place. And he says, in order to write about a place, you need to retain the traveler's eye, even if you are a resident. 9 years is a long time to understand a place well and short enough not to become blind to it. Right, he's writing this, of course, about Chennai. But then, writing about Chai Chai, he also writes that it is a book with which everyone gets to see a bit of himself or herself in it. As I said, it is a very Indian book. There is no scope for either borrowing the lines or setting from the Western books you admire. It talks about the real India, live and kicking, and at times not so kicking. So dominantly in BG's ideas, of course, lies the fact that he's trying to construct an alternative India. This is the first theme that I would like to draw your attention to. I have a few notes with me. And he says that, and this is the entire conjecture of the novel, that there are many Indias with many contact zones. Now, you see, when we approached travel as a mode of contact, as a mode of traversing not only space, but encountering different cultures, And BG quotes Mark Twain when Mark Twain says, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts." Therefore, many contact zones. What are these contact zones? And what are these Indias? Metropolitan India versus rural and small town India. Right? That's the first contact zone. But don't forget that even these interactions in the contact zone largely take place within asymmetrical power relations. BG, traveling as an English metropolitan journalist, is almost always, and male, is almost always in a superior position to that of the small town, primarily Hindi speaking or within the local languages speaking local population. So it's a kind of a travelogue where really there is no transculturation on the part of BG, right? It's rather a kind of an encounter that takes place between the two Indias. And this encounter becomes urgent, I find, because of the context of globalization, where post 1990s, the entire gamut of India, the entire geography of India becomes a space into which the capitalist market economy seeks to establish its footprint. Now, you see, this progress of the capitalist economy, has been slow but gradual, in the sense that it invaded metropolitan India first, changed the urban landscape, and then moved towards the rural and small town India, as it were. So, how does a historical evolution occur? We've so far seen travelogues from colonial India, and then you have a set of travelogues which talk about the Nehruvian model of modernism, which is based on heavy industries, public industries, cooperatives, the establishment of industrial cities, the proliferation of the railway network, and then the withering of that Nehruvian vision, the failure of the public sector, and the movement towards new globalized public sector, which does not merely talk about the nation as a market, but opens up to the international market, as it were, and claims the international market as its own. So, in many ways, Chai Chai is a book which is meant both for Indians as well as for the international people to want to know what lies beyond metropolitan India. So, contact zones and the many Indias that BG talks about. Of course, this is about also aspirational India, which lives in its metropolitan zones, an aspirational India that thrives on big brands, that looks at good food, restaurants, and the small town, which is tentatively taking its step from the older small town bias to newer phenomenon. And therefore, in a certain sense, it is where aspirational India is coming to terms with an India which is just waking up to aspirations. So different stages of post-independence modernity and consumer behavior that you will find in Chai Chai. One of the important terms, therefore, of Chai Chai is looking at these spaces economically in the ways in which they are marked by sastai. The metropolitan man is amazed at the price of wine and other drinks that he can find in these watering holes. And also, at the same time, you have the presence of the Tata Bazaar or the Chaupal Bazaar, where we see that the aspirations of the metropolis are gradually making its way into these zones. So caught within an economic transition, the many Indias. There's also another interesting division that you know BG makes in the way that he's talking about a north-south divide within India. And he's talking about varieties in terms of culture, in terms of dressing. You remember the ways in which the Keralite dresses. He's taking in the ways in which, in the inflections with which they speak, the ways in which jasmine flowers are put on the head, and so on and so forth. So it's a meticulous record of the cultural divide that exists between the north and the south. Yet, at the same time, BG also sees certain pan-Indian forces. What are these forces? For example, religion. Of course, is going in the southern part of India to a Hanuman Mandir, is going to Falahari Baba in Mughal Sarai, and the way in which religion sort of binds people. Very interestingly, it's almost a sort of black and white between, not black and white, that's the wrong word to use, I'm sorry. It's almost a kind of the presence of the Hindu and the Muslim only. There's no Christian town that BG visits, as it were, in Chai Chai. And he talks about communal harmony, presence of religion, the presence of the railways is another major factor that unites India, the circulatory system. And these towns are well defined in terms of the vards. And he talks about the effect of the unions and the way in which this incursion of private capital and the withering of the Nehruvian vision of India has been almost pan-Indian. So at the end of the day, Guntakal and Kanpur are united in the way in which they have both withered from bustling, textile towns to be, ghost towns, as it were, decaying ghost towns. Therefore, there is associated with this, therefore, BG's own the theme of his own personal selfhood, his pan-Indian identity, born as a Bengali, bred up as a North Indian, and professionally and at home as a South Indian. So in the way in which this, BG has moved in the way the Indian Railways has moved, he's talked about in the final passages of the text of having drawn an S. Now that S is also BG in many ways, in the ways in which he has really sort of encapsulated within it himself a kind of a pan-Indian personality. And this pan-Indian personality actually offers him a kind of an overview, a kind of a legitimacy to comment on the affairs of both the north-south divides, as it were. I've already talked about post-Indian Nehruvian modernity versus globalized modernity. We find this in the incursion of fair and lovely in Mughal Sarai. So why not, the face pack, as it were, which Mughal Sarai will use as much as, a Delhiite will use. We've talked about the Chaupal Bazaar and the way in which Tata Sky antennas and set-top boxes are to be found in that corner of Guntakal. And we also see the ways in which, these hill stations are being taken over gradually by the metropolitan babus, as it were. So it's a tale of, newer zones coming up, newer textile bases, and the older, larger factories withering away. So very importantly, right across the north and the south, in Itersi, for example, the railway town is now much shrunken, as is Guntakal, as is Jolarpettai, as is Shoranur. So a common factor of this is that the Nehruvian vision of India is now making way for a more globalized modern India. And this is also a feature of not only many Indias, but many Indias across historical times. So that is one major theme that I would like to highlight in this particular travelogue. Then, of course, there is the issue of the railways, in the ways in which not only has, you know, the towns changed, but railways have also changed. If there's the chai chai, which is, a kind of a perennial call, then the railways have also changed. They've shunted away stations. The pantry cars have come up. So uh, places where they used to stop no longer exist. Coach factories have changed locations. So how the political landscape, the change in the political economic landscape has actually forced the railways also to evolve. And the role of the railways in this globalized economy of transferring the iron ore or the finished product from Guntakal to the rest of the world is, as it were, the function of the railway. So, part of BG's text is also an acknowledgement of the role that the railways have traditionally played and is now playing within the Indian scenario. Now, there's, of course, another very interesting thing that you must have noticed in BG's travelogue, and that is an important theme. That travel in BG's, text is almost a kind of a male preserve, right? It's a very male text in that sense. You will not find really any independent, or even for that matter, any compatriot who's a female in BG's text who's traveling, or really any young woman who's in that sense, as it were, independent or empowered, right? The women whom he talks about unequivocally are victims. Say Kela Bai, for example, who is a victim of patriarchy in that sense, bitten by a snake and is, become a kind of a celebrity in her own right. Majnu, for example, Manju, for example, who is a victim of, the small town going awry, right? And the woman who bathes on the banks of the river, whom BG so unashamedly, gawks at, as it were, stares at. So it's a text whose weakness lies in the fact that of the many Indias that it really talks about, there's only, as it were, a male India. There's no really any presence of the female, as it were, within BG's vision of India. And that, I think, is something that BG might have revised, because when he's writing this novel in 2006 and 2007, the India that he talks about has already tried to shift somewhat towards women empowerment. So a travelogue that is very silent about this kind of a vast majority of the people, has this kind of a blemish. The travel encounters are almost always seen in terms of the male prerogative. Now, when we get to interview BG, I think some of you might raise this issue for him as to what is the cause of the absence of the female voice almost totally within BG's travelogue. Of course, these smaller towns are often seen in terms of being the backwaters of modernity, as it were, marked by superstition and credulity. Right. So here is BG, who is from the metropolitan center, sort of condescendingly looking down at the report that takes place about this woman who's, as it were, possessed by the ghost of the snake. There's, of course, other superstitions that are described also in these places, and therefore, there is a suggestion, and BG is also very carefully looking into the psychology of the small town, that people are idle in the afternoon and the evening, and that it is an atmosphere of perenniality, as it were, no change, a life which is not marked by any ripples but by the constant still water. Therefore, looking at this, as it were, small town mentality. Also, very interestingly, is that BG almost invariably talks to people who are in their middle ages. There's no real interaction with any youth and their aspirations. So, in a certain sense, the travelogue is limited in the ways in which BG presents only one aspect of these small towns. But there's also another theme, and that I think is very interesting in the way in which BG is trying to present a kind of a profound nostalgia about a way of life that once existed but exists no more. You know, in the sense of, you know, this word which I have used, this yearning. Now, for the small town, the yearning is to go to a large town. The aspiration is to arrive. And therefore, the small town person feels that BG is good looking because he stays in an AC. He unashamedly asks him, "What is your salary?" And then whenever, Bhagat, for example, is given this offer that, whether he would like to work in a larger town, he immediately jumps at it and says, "Is there a position?" So there is a yearning of the small town to travel to the metropolis. And there's a reverse yearning of the nostalgia of a sense of loss of the past that the metropolitan town has lost, and is therefore trying to somewhere revisit through the travel of the metropolitan to these small cities. So in a certain sense, BG's text would be probably read written in English by the urban sort of middle class in metropolitan towns, picking up the book in, say, Wheelers or on Amazon, to think about the life that has gone by, right? But it's a book which is not really about youth, is it? It's a book which is about middle-aged men and older men talking about older times. And therefore, there is this sense of a nostalgia of the Indian past, and somewhere probably an inadequate reflection on the Indian present. This is something which BG does not really talk about. Of course, there's the other theme of time and timelessness. There are various kinds of time in this particular travelogue. The metropolitan, which is concerned with the here and the now. So it's the effervescent present that is the theme of the metropolis, although BG does not describe the metropolis. Then there are these smaller towns which are rooted in the past and then trying to look to the present, right? So that's the metropolis. And then there are certain locations, for example, Banaras, say, for that matter, and also Khajuraho, which are locked in the past, right? So they're marked by a sense of timelessness, as it were. And Banaras becomes this fascinating place, which is at once present, at once past, and at once timeless. So BG makes these, distinctions among places and these varieties of Indian locations very interestingly to present India as a kind of a potpourri, a kind of a collage of different spaces with different kinds of ideas about time. I find this particular aspect of how BG sort of reconciles space and time and juggles with it to highlight and provide insights about them as particularly fascinating within the narrative. The last point that I'd like to make, and that's the last theme that I really noticed, is this concept of sameness and uniqueness, right? Every town is unique in its own way, yet they are same in their own way, that they are, monstrous junctions, but little towns. They are sleepy places where modernity is trying to, globalized modernity is trying to find an incursion. And yet, they are also same because they are important railway stops. And the cry of chai chai kind of reverberates. And chai chai becomes very important here because you see, chai chai and these small towns, and the description of the book, ironically, pull across two different ways. And I'm going to talk about this narrative pull and push in a brief while. But you see, Chai Chai presents a cry about a homogeneous India, right? Which is marked by the presence of the railways and which is marked by a kind of a sameness. Also, these towns are same in the way in which you might compare one with the other. Yet, BG also celebrates the plurality of India, the plurality of its food, its vegetation, its people, its dresses, and so on and so forth, in the way in which each town comes to life with its own kind of nuances, as it were, in each single travelogue. So I've outlined more or less 10 themes within BG's text. I just repeat them one by one. Many Indias, many contact zones. The division of the North and the South, dissimilarities, similarities, and the way in which they are integrated. The question of BG's selfhood and the pan-Indian consciousness. The theme of post-independence Nehruvian modernity making way for a globalized modern India. We've also talked about railways and its changing faces and its role in globalization. We've talked about the very male universe of BG, and even if there are women, they're either victims or gazed at. So the text has a distinctly, sexual bias, as it were. Then there's this question about the small town as analyzed as a backwater of modernity in the presence of superstition, credulity, and poverty. Then there's, of course, this eighth theme of yearning and reverse yearning, the yearning of the small town for the metropolitan glitz and glamour, and the nostalgic yearning of the metropolitan for the past that he can no longer access. Then we've talked about time and timelessness in the way in which BG thinks about three different kinds of Indias: the present, engaged with the present, struggling with the past, and looking forward to the present, and certain spaces like Banaras and Khajuraho, which are rooted in timelessness. And the 10th theme that I talked about was sameness and uniqueness that BG really talks about. So these are the themes that I've noticed, and these are themes which you might consider when you read Chai Chai very carefully. And these are questions that I might ask you in my university questions as to how does BG reconcile differences, and how does what are the economic realities, what are the many Indias that BG seeks to create, and what are the absences within these many Indias. Remember the female question. I think that's a very important omission that BG makes. And I'll also go on and add that largely BG does not in any way really interact with the youth of these small towns. So we have just a partial glimpse of a middle-aged or a senior part of the town. And therefore this element of the past and the nostalgia haunt, as it were, Chai Chai. Now let me come to the next segment of my discussion, and that is the narrative technique and the style of BG's travelogue. Now remember, this is an extremely popular travelogue. It goes into a second edition in almost 6 weeks. So what is it that BG is doing right? Why is it that people are so drawn to BG's text? The first thing that I would like to notice is, and this is my first point in terms of style and technique, is this very careful attention to empirical details. And I would like to suggest here that, this is a book about the everyday. Now, a couple of reviews of this text have, suggested that this book is bland. And, at the end, the reviewer has commented, what is this? What was all that fuss about? But the strength of the book also lies in these small details. Think about, say, Cholarpettai, for example, where he's looking at the overbridge and he's seeing the monkey and the dog playing. And these the small empirical details come alive. The wood apple seller, for example, selling apples, and the craving for the wood apple that BG has at that point of time. These are very small details that of the everyday that we encounter daily, which BG writes with great endearing. And therefore, this is also a book of the everyday. As we as he said, it's something for every Indian to recognize and reciprocate. So there is a degree of empiricism. The second is something which I borrow straight away from, once again, Carl Thompson, as Carl talks about, the extent to which one reveals oneself in the travelogue. And the travelogue is also both private history and public history. And it is here that you see BG's private journey and his gradual unraveling of his private self. Or let us not talk about BG's personal journey. Let us talk about, the narrator's personal journey and the ways in which he talks about his childhood, his anxieties about disease, his kind of hotel hardening, his evolution as a traveler, right? Therefore, also there are moments when the travelogue is intensely self-conscious and self-deprecatory. For example, when he's struggling with the hotel in Mughal Sarai, he then, his own self seems to be divided and seems to mock at himself, saying, well, you deserve it, you didn't make a reservation, right? So it's very interesting in the way in which, the self, the traveler's self, as it were, is presented in the text. It is his prism through which we see the town. It is his impressions that go into the making of the travelogue. The third thing, which incidentally links up with this issue, is what is the version of the self. Now, I've already talked about one aspect of the self as being, as it were, the pan-Indian self. BG is also aware that he's a metropolitan Indian. He sometimes lets loose his condescension. For example, when he sees an English error, he cannot but resist making a mocking comment. But by and large, you see, BG's text seeks to present himself as a cool, non-judgmental, everyday bloke who can mix around with the people. The man with curiosity. You see, in one of his blogs, if you study them carefully, he says that there are two things that a travel writer must have, right? One is this curiosity about people, the desire to know more and more people. And the second is this capacity to take notes. And he sort of self-flagellates himself. He says, I should have taken more notes. But this element of the fine detail and this element of presenting yourself as the everyday bloke who can, walk into a bar, mix around with people, and also, be the common man, right? So it is here you see that this cool dude figure that BG sort of wants to project before us is highlighted through his journeys to the bars everywhere. BG, of course, sees the bar as the mini India where he can, at one place get to know both the working class and also the other classes of people. But equally, he's the man who's slightly off morals, as it were. He's not a moralistic kind of a judgmental man. So therefore, his encounters at the drinking bars become very interesting spaces within the text, and his projection of the self is that of the cooler, the kind of smart, everyday or common man narrator. If you take a look carefully at his style, the style is anecdotal. It is marked by a certain degree of randomness. Now, you see, one of the most important things in the text is its random travel, right? He goes to Mughal Sarai and then starts out to look for hotels. He does not have a fixed itinerary or a fixed place of stay. So therefore, one of the endearing features is, BG is like the reader as it were struggling in a new area, trying to find out, and this personal struggle works its way into the narrative as well. So the anecdotal style, the hotel, the bathroom, these are, issues of anecdotes. There are stories about his meeting people, for example, meeting, say, Mr. Awasthi, from whom he will talk about the Deen Dayal. He will talk to the Falahari Baba, for example. He will talk to the station masters. He will talk to the journalists, for example. He will talk to Manju, the woman, for example. And therefore, highly impressionistic random narrative, a kind of a collage. And this motive of the collage, I think, is very important in the way he sees India itself as this collage of different classes, professions of people. So he's trying to weave within the text. If you look at it very carefully and underneath, this pattern of a collage of multiplicity and linked together by those railway narratives. So the anecdotal style adds, and the randomness of travel adds to the sense of the collage. There's also this sense of spicy details. Food is a running theme, and the way in which he savors his food with the chaiwala, the chaatwala, the samosa seller, the magoda wala, the idli wala, right? All these, add spice to the text. Very small details, of course, and BG spices up, his text with metaphors. For example, I referred to, the railways as the circulatory system of India. He talks about, places which are like virgins waiting to be deflowered, and so on and so forth. And there is always this kind of humor which plays upon within the text, the kind of humor that very often, does not allow the text to settle into any kind of ulterior seriousness. You see, BG's text is not trying to give us a message. Even though I am trying to sort of find out a kind of a pattern within it very seriously as a critic, part of the fun of BG's text is its humor in the way in which it continuously kind of, ironically mocks at times. It continuously mocks himself. It continuously creates the metaphor and therefore spices up the narrative, the empirical details with the impressions and with the anecdotes. One of the things that I've noticed within the text, of course, is despite these empirical details, there are times when BG goes into generalizations. The North-South generalization is very important, is very obvious. For example, there's of course this entire idea of kind of branding a place with reference to its the perception that he has. Therefore, Mughal Sarai is, as it were, a kind of a very criminally infested place. And he's very curious about this. Often turns out to be ironical, because the criminally infested Mughal Sarai is a far more communally conducive location than the historical Banaras, which turns out to be more communal than Mughal Sarai ever was, right? So of course, also there are these generalizations he makes, and these kind of metropolitan generalizations about the farmer's meal constituting of a roti and an onion. These are somewhere in the way in which he judges this driver and thinks he might give him some money when he finds out that his pension is worth quite a little bit. So in many ways, there are moments when there are certain presuppositions that are worked in from BG. Now, the travel to Arokkanam is very interesting, incidentally, because he does not linger over there. Whenever he sees that the small town is a replica of the larger town and suburb, he immediately moves away. He does not try to make any distinction as to see what kind of life that town can offer to him. So he's going there with a presupposition. These towns are going to look like this, right? And that presupposition often takes away some of the charm of the discovery. So there is a certain picture that is created of the small town junction station, and is sort of trying to kind of uh, repeat that value over and over again, although with different contexts. I have also talked about the seventh quality, that is self-consciousness, and the ways in which the private and the public histories interact, how the travelogue moves one through the junctions and also through the signposts of BG's life. And by the time that we've discovered this S-shaped space of India, we've also traversed somewhere within the S-shaped figure of Vishwanath Ghosh, that S that is part of his name as well. There's, of course, a great irony in the text, which you must have noticed, most of you, that even though this book is about chai chai, this book is about railway journeys and so on and so forth, the journey is not the motive. It is the smaller towns. It's not the railway station and the chai vendor who are the heroes of the text. It's the people beyond the station. And he makes this very boundary very clear when he says that these railway stations are, as it were, cities and countries by themselves where we are temporary citizens. But his aim is, even though the chai chai is just that point of entry, to look beyond the gate of the station and explore the city beyond. So in a sense, that term chai chai is pretty ironic in that sense of the term. There's also, of course, as I have pointed out, he endears himself to us by the nitty-gritties of travel, right? Finding a hotel, finding a good place to eat, clean bathroom, clean sheets. So BG is also the traveler next in our next seat, as it were. We take him within our fold. He can quickly slip into our fold with a chatty English. And therefore, this chatty style, the kind of ways in which he mixes the Hindi and the English, and therefore offers us with a kind of register in which almost every Indian speaks, this bilingual Indian, and who has traveled and who understands the nitty-gritties of travel. Of course, not every Indian would, to cure his acidity, would go in for a drink. He would rather take an antacid. So sometimes BG does go overboard to a little bit, but the nitty-gritties of travel, and we tend to believe him. He tends to be this fellow traveler, and this empirical gaze, the revelation of this selfhood, also makes this travelogue a kind of a journey. But there are always two journeys here: the journey of BG the traveler and the journey of we through the train stations of the country. And finally, we would like to talk about this once again, this hybrid selfhood that he possesses, this kind of positionality that he occupies as somebody who belongs everywhere, does not belong anywhere, somebody who can travel everywhere but not rest anywhere. There are, of course, a few deficiencies of these travels, and BG himself has written about how he would probably have devoted more time to a space, fleshed out much more interaction within these spaces if he had written it all over again. But that would have taken away, some of the fun of this, the spice of the travelogue. You see, these are small, as it were, pani puris which you take down, and they are filled with these tangy impressions of BG. So in that sense, there are some major omissions within BG. Women, for example, youth, for example. It is a tale which is told by a middle-aged man about middle-aged men in certain ways, with its, with its liberal doses of nostalgia. And when we come to this question of literary value, which was one of the problematic areas which Carl Thompson's book pointed out, and which I was also talking about, the travelogue, as it were, exists in that middle point between information and literary value. Now, in the empirical details, in the facts that BG provides, this text has little literary value in those parts. But in the impressions, in the ways in which BG carefully weaves a pattern of linking together the private and the public, in the way in which he talks about the anecdote of the fast bowler who becomes this vendor when the mills close down, the guard who has not received his salary for 11 months. We realize how skillfully BG is weaving this public private past presence narrative and imbuing this with a kind of earthy everyday rhetoric that provides it with a strange kind of yearning, as it were, linking the past and the present, the small town and the large town, linking the commoner with the traveler, and so on and so forth. So it is in this hybridity, it is in this multiplicity, it is in this pan-Indian consciousness that BG builds, that the literary value of Chai Chai lies. Finally, who constitutes his readerships? I do not know. I'll ask, and you can ask BG also, whether he's ever really thought about this issue of readership. But this is a metropolitan readership, although BG has been translated into Hindi and Marathi, and I guess that readership is slightly different. But I would consider the readership of this book to be primarily metropolitan, who have had experiences of small town life, who can recognize with some nostalgia a past which they have left behind, and also a curious readership, young readership, which would like to know what these different Indias are like. So these are some of the stylistic devices that I could talk about, the narrative technique. Let me just revise them once for your benefit. The first, I talked about empirical details, the everyday lives, the small factual statements. The second is the revelation of the self, which I consider to be the most important part of the travelogue. The third is this projection of a cool narrator, one who is, deliberately slightly rebellious, who can mix around with people, smart, who does not really bother too much about comforts. Then there's this anecdotal style of characterization with impressionistic narrative. Then I talked about the chatpata, tangy, style, the fondness for metaphor and humor. I talked about problems of generalizations and somewhere lumping together identities. Then comes, of course, the self-consciousness of the public and the personal histories. And I think that is where the richness of the travelogue lies. We talked about irony and how this is not really about Chai Chai, but entirely about something else. And we talked about the nitty-gritties of travel, the endearing fellow traveler that BG becomes with us. And then I talked about the cosmopolitanism and the multiple identities of BG, his Bengali identity, his North Indian, his South Indian identity. Taken together then, the narrative technique of Chai Chai adequately abets the kind of theme of BG, to present this many Indias. It's this chatty, it's this, as it were, tale which brings together the anecdotal to talk about and to try and excavate from, as it were, completely similar homogeneous junction towns, radically sort of multiple Indias, at the same time going back to the small town. So this text continually, wavers between similarities and dissimilarities, pluralities and uniformities, and therefore, never ceases to fascinate us as we take this journey. So these are some of the features I wanted you to be alert to, some of the themes and the narrative techniques. I have spoken quite a lot about this travelogue. I don't think it has, encountered such critical discourses, and I'm sure BG must be laughing at me in the way in which I'm taking apart his text and trying to sift and find meanings through it. But then that's the difference between the travel writer and the academic, as it were. So we'll get to know more about these themes, and I would invite you to ponder and read the text, so that when we actually meet him in person over Zoom, a date which you will give me, we can ask our questions about travel writing, about what BG, the modern travel writer, feels, what kind of India he's looking at, how India features in his travels, and what are the stylistic innovations that he brings in to travel writing. I've deliberately not talked about butterloo chicken in Ludhiana because I've already talked about it in the first lecture. But I might add just one thing, that gradually more and more travel texts are recognizing that India does not only lie in these larger towns, which anyways have been written enormously about. It also lies in these smaller spaces of India, in the times and the timelessnesses in which they travel. And therefore, I think, like Chai Chai, we'll see many more such, travels across smaller town Indias. Right? Maybe, who knows, someday, after having taken this course, you might be impelled to write your own travel narrative about your small town. Till then, thank you very much for having attended. I see no questions right now. This brings the formal, classes of Chai Chai to a close. If you have questions, note them down. We can ask BG. And then, of course, we can have a final sort of discussion when, of course, the bell will be tolling for you and the exams will be near. So till then, thank you very much, and have a very good evening.